3 yesterday, we covered the bit where Esther ambushes Haman. There was this woman who kept gasping. So we're reading through the chapter, and she's like, and they were reading something, and she's like, oh, I didn't see that coming. Oh, I can't believe it, she said. It was so funny. All right, so what was going on last week with the ambush of Haman? How did it go? Well, obviously it worked, but I mean, what happened?
She's gasping about Esther's, what do you call it? Her bravery in going to the king, really.
Yeah.
She was asking for something that was pretty serious.
Yes?
So that was something to gasp over.
Yes, it was very shrewd the way she did it.
Yeah.
She basically set Haman up so that he ended up looking like a traitor. And, well, what did the king do? Well, yeah, I mean, he wasn't trying to ambush the king, but it looked that way, you know, by the end of it. It looked like he was stabbing the king in the back.
The thought and outcome turned because what Haman had in mind for himself, fell to Mordecai.
Yep.
And including the gallows that he wanted to hang Mordecai on.
Yeah.
So
So
the gallows.
that's right. So everything reversed. So the situation between Haman and Mordecai got reversed. What else got reversed? Remember?
His job and his land.
Yeah. He took over his property and his everything.
Yeah.
Yes. And he's now the second in command, basically, under the king. And what kinds of things reversed for the people?
They went from confusion to celebration.
Because now Mordecai and Esther have sent out this edict that gives them the right to assemble and protect themselves on the day when they were supposed to be annihilated. So on the night when the king had insomnia, God just set in motion a reversal that's just, there's a huge ripple effect now on the whole empire of how everything is coming undone from the way it was before. Okay, anything else you want to add?
Can I add something?
Yes.
About the last chapter? I just found it so significant. I wasn't here last week to comment on this, but I found it so significant. The last sentence in chapter 8, and many of the people of the land became Jews because of the fear of the Jews fell upon them. And, you know, thinking about many people becoming Christians when Paul and Peter, well, when Peter preached, you know, you see those large conversions. And here, there was no preaching from Paul. But I just think relationships were very important here. It says fear of the Jews came upon them, but I think that throughout that land, you know, God had told those people to go into captivity and to set down roots and to make a life for themselves in captivity. And I think they had relationships with their neighbors, and their neighbors hopefully saw things in them that were enticing. And I think that's a lesson for us in our time, to be sweet in spirit to those around us. We don't have to necessarily preach. But when the hard times come, people are going to be looking.
And I think, when you said that, it just occurred to me, something that fascinates me in all of this is that, again, God never gets mentioned. The people of Israel were supposed to make their God known to the nations. They didn't do it because they became like the nations instead. But here is God making himself known, even though he's never mentioned in the book. He's making himself known through the things that are happening while his people are in captivity for their own sin. He's still using his people to make himself known to the nations.
He is using everything to his glory.
That's right. Calling Gentiles to himself, which seems crazy in the situation that they're in, but that's what he's doing.
See, I read more as they became Jews, as they became more spiritual, understanding who the Jewish God was.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Fear of Jehovah, this God is powerful and overturning.
Yeah.
Was it last week or the week before when you did that literary structure?
Last week.
I have read that, and it's just phenomenal to me how intricate that was composed and by a God who not mentioned. How it just, has anybody done that? I suppose there are authors that attempted at this point, since it's recognized as a literary structure, but is it, do you know, or is that just a biblical thing?
Well, it's like, I don't know if people mimic it or not, but like if you read A Christmas Carol is an example of that kind of structure where you have a point in the middle where everything starts to get reversed.
You know,
So,
we were
yeah.
reading Pastor was in Luke, and that was the first time I heard that mentioned. And I can't remember what chapter it was, so I know we were in Luke, and he was comparing that. And that's where I heard the word, what's it called?
Peripety,
Yeah.
which I had never heard before I read
Yeah,
this
and
one.
he was going through them, and so it was like, oh wow, so you mentioned it, here it is again.
Yeah. It's very carefully crafted. Like the author has done those things on purpose to make a point. And well, we were talking about it yesterday at Set Free, and I remember saying, you know, why do you include that structure? Because you want to emphasize what's in the middle. What's in the middle? And I was waiting for someone to say, the king can't sleep. And the woman sitting next to me said, the hand of God.
Wow.
That's what's in the middle.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what's there, is the hand of the God who never gets mentioned. That's what's in the middle. That's what turns the tables. Yes.
I read, and I've been trying to complete this Beth Moore Bible study on Esther for years. And I think I started it in your Esther class a couple times, but, you know, for the past.
Yep.
I was reading that the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto of Poland, that they had the book of Esther with them, and if Hitler found him with the book of Esther, they would be killed.
Which makes sense,
But
doesn't
they-
it? Because of what it's about.
To God's promise,
Yeah.
you know, in the book, not promise, but
Yeah.
protection in
Yes.
the book of Esther, and how they overcame
Yeah.
evil, the Jews did. And here, you know, they were facing this big evil of Hitler annihilating them in modern day times, and they clung to this book of the Bible.
Yeah, which seems so appropriate. Yeah.
Kind of interesting.
All right, well, let's finish it. So, chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman. You can read their names for yourself. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on gallows. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes near and far to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore these days were called Purim, from the word pure. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abigail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Okay, so how does it start in verses 1 to 5?
Well, on the 13th day of Adar, the Jews overpowered those who hated them.
Yes,
So it was just reversed.
That's right.
To happen.
the day of destruction chosen by the lots becomes the day of deliverance for the Jews. And the first verse in the chapter puts that reversal front and center, and it's powerful and it's profound, that what was intended for evil turned out for good. So this day intended for the annihilation of the Jews by Haman, the king, the lots, the gods, the stars, whatever, actually turns out for their deliverance because God set this reversal in motion. So this reversal that started in chapter 6 finishes here when the tables are turned, and now the Jews get the upper hand. So on this day, the enemies of the Jews were going to overpower them, but instead, the Jews are not only spared, but they overpower their enemies. They assemble together in all these provinces across the empire, and it's not like they're standing alone because the government officials and the nobles are helping them now. Why are they helping the Jews?
Afraid of them.
Because they're afraid of
The father of Mordecai.
Mordecai. So they're afraid of the Jews and they're afraid of Mordecai. Why are they afraid of Mordecai? Because he's got so much power now. I mean, it's just amazing how God took him from sitting at the gate, refusing to bow down to an Amalekite, to now having the kind of power where people all across the empire, you remember how big this empire is, all across the empire, people are afraid of Mordecai. And so now the government officials, instead of attacking the Jews, are helping them. Now just stop for a minute and think of the weight of this. That the situation for the Jews has been totally reversed. And I don't mean just that they're delivered instead of destroyed. I mean their situation from the beginning of the book has been reversed. You remember how at the beginning they didn't even get mentioned in chapter 1 because they were so unimportant and insignificant. They're like a byword in this massive empire where they're trying to fly under the radar because whatever people think of them, they don't have most favored nation status, and they're trying not to rock the boat. So here they are just quietly going about, whatever, with no power, no military, nobody to lead them, And now all of a sudden, their situation is the total opposite of what it was at the beginning of the book. It's amazing how this ethnic minority suddenly comes to all this power and prominence. And now everybody knows that Esther is a Jew. I mean, she was trying to keep that a secret. That's not a secret anymore. Everybody knows who she is. And everybody knows who Mordecai is, that he's a Jew too. Because the Jews have two people in positions of power in the kingdom. And they themselves now have gained a completely new level of power in the empire. So, people across the empire fear and help them. And how long did that battle take? 1 day in the empire, 2 days in Susa, right? So basically, God overturned their situation in 2 days. It's astonishing how, of course, there's all this lead up before that battle. It wasn't just a 2-day thing because things happened all in preparation for that. But here, it looks like, the Jews are an oppressed minority, and they have this 1-2 day battle, and suddenly their situation is the total opposite of what it was before. God really does just raise up the low and bring down the high, and he just did it with the Jews. Okay, now what happens in Susa in 6 to 15?
Killed 500.
Yeah?
Killed 500 people, and it seems like verses 14 and 15, kind of come after where it says that they killed Haman's sons too, because then it says again that they were hanged, and Esther asks if that could happen. So it seems like that could that could have been written down before that, where it says that they were killed and destroyed.
Yeah, there's just a
They're
repetition.
better.
There's a repetition of what.
Yeah, right. So it explains how it happened, because she asked for their death, and the king gave it.
That's right.
But there's a big emphasis on them not taking the plunder.
That's right. This whole bit is interesting because it's the hardest part to read because it's so violent. But the thing is, what's happening right here is more than just self-defense. This is an act of judgment. And right here, the Jews of this generation succeed where King Saul failed. That's the thing that's really important right here. So, led by 2 Benjamites from Saul's own clan, the Jews carry out the judgment of God against their enemies, executing all these people in Susa and across the empire. The author doesn't say anything about the Agagites as a group, but this is the last time the Agagites or the Amalekites get mentioned in Scripture. That's not to say that there might have been some hangers-on here or there who escaped, but as a people group, they never get mentioned again. God has fulfilled his promise to wipe out this nation, and he does it on this day. Now, why would this be a case of God's judgment rather than the Jews just defending themselves? Well, one, because of what happens to the Agagites or the Amalekites. And the author makes a point of telling us that they kill the 10 sons of Haman, listed off by name, who are Agagites. Why does that matter? Because it's not just that they kill the sons of their enemy, it's that they kill the descendants of the ancient Amalekite king, which Saul didn't do. But Esther does it. Esther does what Saul didn't. And so she gets rid of the descendants of Agag. And then she asks for the bodies of the men to be impaled publicly. Why would she do that? Well, because it was customary in ancient warfare for the side that was victorious to display the bodies of the enemies they conquered, and specifically the bodies of the kings, the princes, or the military leaders. This happens in other places in the Old Testament, and actually this same thing happened to Saul and his sons when they were killed by the Philistines. The Philistines did this. So this is what you do when you're in the middle of warfare. That's really interesting, because when she asks for their bodies to be impaled, what it tells me is that she's not looking at this as passive self-defense. She's looking at it as active warfare, where the Jews have conquered their enemies, where the Jews have conquered the Amalekites. And she's now displaying the bodies of the men who would have been the most prominent among the people who were the enemies of the Jews. So the Jews aren't led out in battle. They can't be, because they're in exile in a foreign land. They don't have a king and they don't have a military leader, but God brings the battle to them. and then gives them victory over the Amalekites and the rest of their enemies who attack them. So there's one indication, I think, that this is judgment and not just self-defense, but the other is that the author mentions 3 times that they don't take the plunder, even though the edict allowed them to do it. Why does that matter?
That's finishing up the job that she was given.
That's right. That's right. And so it started with Joshua and the judgment of God on the Canaanites. And it came back under Saul. Do you remember what Saul did with the Amalekites?
Yeah, he kept all that.
He
He
kept-
said, oh, the people wanted to keep these good animals because they'd be good for sacrifice.
Yep. That was the time when Samuel's like, why do I hear bleeding?
Yeah, right.
Bleating, yes. And Saul's like, well. And the fact that he kept the plunder when he wasn't supposed to was actually the reason that God rejected him as the king. So it's a big deal when they're taking plunder when they shouldn't, because this is not supposed to be a way for them to get wealthy. It's supposed to be an act of judgment by God on his enemies. And so here again, it seems clear the Jews interpret their current situation as a judgment by God. And so in 2 cases now, the Jews in Persia do what Saul didn't. And specifically, the Benjamite queen of Persia does what the Benjamite king of Israel didn't. It's like she comes back around and does what the first king of Israel was guilty of not doing. But now he has someone descended from his clan who comes back and does what he should have done, and it turns out it's a woman.
Yeah.
And she's not the queen of Israel, she's the queen of Persia, but still does what Saul didn't do the first time. And I was thinking, I kind of wish it weren't so violent, but before I could tell Esther to go easy on these men, you have to remember the consequences of Saul's disobedience. The fact that Saul didn't do this when he should have brought consequences for the people, for Israel, and for his own people, the people in the tribe of Benjamin. And so Esther and Mordecai and the rest of the Jews wouldn't have been in this situation to start with if Saul had just obeyed the command of the Lord. And so here is Esther doing something violent, but what she's doing, she should be commended for, because she does what Saul didn't. She obeys this command and she brings judgment on the Amalekites.
Well, probably flood of people, but not just a small stack of the Jews. They're going to annihilate.
That's right. And it's not like the Jews are...
It isn't like excessive.
No, it's not.
They have to annihilate.
That's right.
Totally.
And it's not like the Jews are going out hunting people down. These are the people who are willing to attack them. I mean, they're allowed to fight, and they do.
And it's contrary to the rule of law. It's interesting, rule of war. She follows the war laws, but then she follows God's direction, which is not plunder, because under the natural state of war during that time, they would have plundered everything.
Yes.
And she shows the judgment of God that at the same time is almost a grace to the people that they're able to get plunder that shows God is different than just the common.
Which also shows such an incredible, I confess to I wasn't a history student and I've read that, but it's an obvious demonstration that she and Mordecai were students of history. And they understood that.
They knew enough to know what was appropriate for them as God's people in this situation.
In light of this, I keep just going back how at the beginning, the King of Xerxes is such a pompous, big wheel, he's everything, and then as we narrow this down, he's just a puppet in God's hands.
Yeah, he is. We're going to come back to that in chapter 10. So hold that thought, because we're going to talk about that in a minute. Yeah.
But doesn't the queen seem to have, the king and the queen seem to have a lot different relationship anyways already, because she and the king are discussing this whole situation, and she always had to ask permission and all that, and here it's like, now they're pals.
Yeah, that's a great segue into what I wrote next. Because the next thing I thought is, you notice how the situation of the queen is totally reversed. So at the beginning of the book, that episode with Vashti made it clear that the queen of Persia had no real power or authority. She's just at the mercy of the whims of the king. Well, we've come a long way since that ridiculous beauty pageant, haven't we? I mean, the queen now has just a breathtaking amount of power and authority, not just in the palace and not just in Susa, but in the empire. Like that she could write edicts that apply to this people group across the whole empire. And the king, well, did you notice that in this section there comes a point where the king actually says to her, "Is there anything else you want?" What? Like he's volunteering to do anything else that she wants. That's amazing.
Spittle king who's up and down for his everything.
Yep.
Drinking. And the next party, the next battle.
Yep.
That he actually has maintained that attitude towards Esther.
Yeah.
Is a miracle.
It is.
That because this was a period of time to get down and accomplished.
Yeah.
Nation that he is even still on good terms with her. Because he's so critical.
Yeah. No one reading the story of Vashti would have ever thought a woman could have this kind of power in his kingdom, let alone a Jewish woman. And did you notice at the end of that bit, the author calls her Queen Esther, the daughter of Abigail. Like using her Persian title together with her Jewish ancestry, just to remind you who she is. And you notice how he keeps saying, he doesn't just say Mordecai, he keeps saying Mordecai the Jew.
Yeah.
Mordecai the Jew, just to emphasize who has the power now. And it's these two Jews. It's a Jewish man and woman who have it. There's no other woman in Jewish history who's had the kind of power and authority that Esther has here in the Persian Empire. It's amazing.
You have that title, oh, here it is, I'm sorry, I just was seeing where that title was that you brought about her being the daughter of.
Okay, now what happens elsewhere in 16 and 17?
If I understood it right, there were, like the army was, let's say the army was called out to destroy the Jews, not all the citizens. So they destroyed the people who were really, or maybe just those who were really against the Jews, but other people were just sort of not. And so they saved all the children and the women, and that was opposite of what
Did they?
God told Saul to do. Well, yeah, they did. They didn't kill the children. Well, no, that isn't in here. That's in Matthew.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if they did or not. I mean, they're
Yeah.
allowed to, and I don't know. If they
But-
killed the sons of Haman, I would assume they killed the grandsons of Haman as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. They were
yeah,
enemies.
yeah. But, outside of Susa, in the rest of the provinces, they assemble to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. It's a one-day war across the entire empire. That's crazy. And did you notice how many of their enemies died on that day?
75,000.
75,000. Wow. But remember how massive this empire is. To have a one-day war when you just wipe out the enemies. Who could do that but God? Like, he brings the battle to the Jews and then gives them victory. When they have, again, no military leader, no one to lead them in battle, but God brings it to them and they're victorious. So, the author includes a bit here to explain why the Jews in the city celebrated on a different day from those in the rural areas, because the fighting in Susa went on for 2 days. I don't know exactly why Esther extended the battle for a second day. I mean, the most obvious reason is that she somehow knew the work wasn't done. Maybe she knew there were some people that had managed to get away or something, I don't know. But they extended a second day and they wipe out the enemies in Susa as well as in the rest of the empire. And in this way, the ancient promises of God are finally fulfilled to preserve his people and to judge their enemies. So the disobedience of Saul brings consequences for his family and his descendants, but it doesn't thwart God's purposes. Even the disobedience of Israel over the centuries and generations that landed them in exile in a pagan empire cannot thwart God's purposes. He still fulfills his promises and he does what he pleases.
Well, as you say that, it makes me, and we talked about this often, but that's a key point for us to remember.
Especially in a week when we had elections.
Yes.
I wonder if it's coincidence that we're studying this the week of an election, because don't we need to be reminded that our God is in control?
Mhm.
Yeah. And he can bring about the fulfillment of his promises with or without big sensational events or miraculous intervention or the cooperation of people. All that stuff's nice, but he doesn't need it. God's faithfulness so often just happens through daily providence, just the orchestration of behind-the-scenes maneuvers, strings of coincidences, mundane details that we don't notice or are never privy to. Our God is so great, so powerful, he can work without miracles, through the ordinary events of billions of human lives, through thousands of years to accomplish his purposes and his promises. This writer says, God delivered an entire race of people in Persia because the king had a sleepless night, a man wouldn't bow down to his superior, and a woman found herself taken by a ruthless king. How unexplainable are the ways of God. Yeah. Like, there's no big miracle right here, and yet it looks miraculous when you see everything line up, doesn't it? You see the hand of God so clearly at work. Okay, now what does Mordecai do in 20 to 22?
He sent letters to all the Jews that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of Adar, and how important it was that they should do that, even their descendants should do that.
Yes, so he establishes this festival for the Jewish people to remember what it is that happened. And then in the section that comes next, in 23 to 28, the author gives us a whole lot of details and description and repetition about the festival. Even kind of summarizes the events with Haman for us again, as if we haven't just read it. But it's like just an emphasis on the fact that this is really, really important. Purim is not one of the holy days included in the law. It's a new festival, but it's important because it marks this time when the grief and mourning of the Jews was turned to celebration and joy. There's something about celebration and joy repeated 5 times right here. Like, just to emphasize how the deliverance of God came, and that the people should stop and think about that and celebrate this time every year.
Do the Jewish people still celebrate this?
They do, yeah. Although someone told me who used to live in Israel, she told me on Tuesday that it's become more secularized. It's slightly more like Halloween or something. Like not with the same connotations of Halloween, but people dress up in costumes like the children do, like Esther and Mordecai, and they give certain kinds of food presents to each other and stuff like that.
And don't they do little, like, melodramas?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, about Haman and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
To me, it sounded a lot like Christmas. So I kept thinking of Christmas, sending gifts to people.
Yeah.
Gifts to the Lord.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so they fast and then they celebrate, and there's this whole feast, and then the author tells us how the festival got its name and reiterates this feast is instituted by Mordecai and Esther, who have full authority, and they write it down in all the records. And it's supposed to be celebrated by the Jews throughout the empire. Did you notice how exhaustive verses 27 and 28 are? Every year, every person in every family in every city in every province is supposed to celebrate through every generation. Why is this so important? Why is it important that they remember this?
It shows God's power. They united with his power.
You need to pass on your faith to the generation. The glory of God and his power. Remind them constantly. Write on the forehead, and when you're on teachers, to your children to walk and talk. Same thing, all through scripture, he says, remember. Do not forget. Do you think he thinks we're short? Have short memories. You think these miraculous things we want to tell our kids and share with them, and yet, even in my own life, God did something wonderful, miraculous 10 years ago. Now, how did that exactly happen? I don't. Yeah, but he certainly is a real person.
Well, I was thinking, I can see a really, I can't criticize the Jews for having a short memory, because I can see an amazing answer to prayer today, and tomorrow morning I'll get up, face a new challenge, and think, I don't know. This might be the day when God hangs me out to dry. This could be it right here. I mean, we need reminders, don't we? Because people have short memories. The people of God have short memories too. And we need to remember, we need to stop and think about these things. And obviously, I mean, Christmas and Easter are not instituted by the Bible, but why are those things important for us as believers? It's important that every year we stop and think about what our God did for us and how he intervened for us, and to celebrate those things and to think on them. And not just these collective kinds of festivals, but I mean, do you do that in your own life? Are there things that have happened to you where you think, I need to remember this? Maybe I need to write a journal down. Maybe I need to keep my prayers in a list. Maybe I need to celebrate a particular day when God did something for me and I saw him intervene, and I need to remember that. Because that's how God shores up our faith for the next thing that comes. I mean, the Jews are never going to face another difficult situation again, are they? I mean, that's the thing, what Donna just mentioned. I mean, you come to World War II. Does it matter that the people of God have something like Esther? Well, it should, because there's a reminder of these ancient promises that God has made, and that those promises still stand, and we need to be reminded of them. Yeah. So the one thing that makes me laugh in all of this is the irony of the festival's name. So I just love it. The festival is called Purim, which means basically the festival of the lots. The name itself is so tongue-in-cheek, and I think it's meant to be. I want to put air quotes around it, like the festival of the lots. Because there's this idea on the surface, the lots chose the date. And it seemed like fate handed the Jews a raw deal, but underneath that, something else was going on, and fate had nothing to do with it. So to anyone who knows the story, the name of the festival is just this one-word reminder of the irony of the whole situation, that this great reversal happened where the day of disaster turned into a day of blessing. Not because of the lots, but because of the hand of God.
Could you also call it the festival of the roll of the dice?
Yeah, you could. The festival of luck.
I mean, that takes me a step further
Yeah,
into language we understand.
that's right. Yeah. The assumption that fate or luck or fortune or something controlled this, but underneath we know that had nothing to do.
I think that was one of the things that always surprised me and mystified me when I first became a Christian and first started reading the Bible, and how they would cast lots to choose which priest was going to serve, and they used that as a valid method of choice, determination.
The other thing that's ironic in this bit is when it mentions that people give portions or presents of food on the feast day. Your translation might not say presents of food, it might just say presents or gifts or something like that. But literally it is portions. That word is translated portions in other places, and I think that's on purpose. I think that alludes to something else. There's coincidentally, it sounds a lot like Psalm 16:5, where David says, "You have assigned me my portion and my cup. You have made my lot secure." It's the same words for portion and lot that are used right here. So God is the one who assigns people their lot and their portion. Not fate, not destiny, not other gods or the stars or karma or whatever. It's God. And the Feast of Purim calls God's people to remember that the physical lots and the physical portions point to a bigger spiritual reality that shows God's in control. Okay, now what does the author add in 29 to 32? Just to make sure we got it.
Mordecai rose to a position of power, second to King Xerxes. His power was used for the good of his people, and he spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews.
Yeah. Yeah, so 29 to 32 and then the first part of chapter 10 both emphasize the power of Esther and Mordecai, and specifically of Mordecai. And, we just get reminded again in 29 to 32 that they have this astonishing amount of power throughout the whole empire, not to command everybody, but to work on behalf of the Jews, and they do. So the fact that Esther and Mordecai could just establish a festival in the Persian Empire for all the Jews. Man, they have a lot of power.
Wasn't there somebody else in Jewish history that rose to power in a foreign land? Oh, Jacob, Daniel.
Joseph.
Joseph,
You know, I
yeah.
see so many parallels to
Okay, yeah,
Joseph.
he was second.
Yeah.
He was second in
Hold that
command.
thought. We'll come back to that. Yeah, hold that thought.
But the other thing is that not only did they talk about the celebration part, but they also said in verse 31, and for times of instructions, for times of fasting and lamentation. So they remember that part of
Yep.
it too.
Yeah, the
Which
feast is preceded by
Right,
mourning and fasting.
and it never says pray. What did that fasting and lamentations?
But yeah, the implication is, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it was pretty.
That's right. That's right. Okay, now, that bit then that we just mentioned, verses 1 to 3, the last part of the book, where it focuses on the power of Mordecai. Okay, and now we get to this point with the king. It kind of cracks me up. So, remember how chapter 1 was all about the king's wealth and his power and the extent of his empire and the display of his affluence? Right here, it's almost like the author mentions him again and then immediately switches to Mordecai. As if Mordecai's, it's like he's saying, okay, now enough about that guy. Let's move on to the guy who really matters. And the guy who really matters is the Jew, is Mordecai. So, here's the king. He's extending taxes now to the ends of his empire, which just tells me now the drama's over and life in the kingdom has gone back to what it was before. And historically, we know that the king was running out of money, and so he had to raise taxes to fund his lifestyle, so he's just back doing what he does best. But then we switch to Mordecai, and if you've read 1st and 2nd Kings, you might know that verse 2 is a standard formula for concluding the reign of a king, to say that everything he did is recorded in the annals of the kings. What's interesting here is that it's not just the king of Persia, but it's Mordecai who gets immortalized in the annals of the Persians and the Medes. So the author emphasizes he's second in command in the empire, he's preeminent among the Jews, he's highly esteemed because he works on their behalf. It's almost like he's functioning as the king of the Jews, looking after their welfare, having all his greatness recorded just like the previous kings of Israel, except now not in Israel's record books, but in the record books of the Persians. So even with no land, no king, no kingdom, living in exile, God can raise people up. And he did, in this case, 2 unlikely Benjamites to become the leaders and deliverers of his people. And now it's the king of Persia who becomes the byword, and it's the Jews who take center stage. Not in history, but in God's word. This is the thing that's important because God stepped in to preserve his people. So, still no mention of God, but it's so clear who's in control. It's so clear that God has lined everything up to fulfill his purposes. Not just his purposes in the immediate situation, but purposes that go back 1,000 years to promises that he made to his people. All right. Let's just reflect on all this a bit. So, how's it relevant to us? Besides the election, which is the obvious one. Why do you think that this story is included for us? Is it because if we trust God, we'll have a happy ending like the Jews did?
I think no. I think it's the opposite. I think it's to encourage us to trust God through our more adverse circumstances. That God is, and remind us that God is in control, and that he uses all things to his glory. And, yeah, I think it's the opposite of what you said.
Well, there are these redemptive reversals all over Scripture, aren't there? So back to what you said about Joseph, and how Joseph actually says what they intended for evil, God intended for good. It happens with Joseph, it happens with Daniel, it happens with Jacob, it happens with all kinds of people. Why are all these redemptive reversals included in Scripture, if not to tell us we're going to have a happy ending?
Because if we just had a bed of roses all the time, we wouldn't be where we are now. But we have troubles, and they should lead us back to God always, when they usually do.
Yeah.
We are strengthened by our trials.
And we like sunshine, but that prayer that Mary read that morning, a couple mornings after she'd been a victim of elder exploitation. It's just really, it's that very thing. It's trusting Him. We want to, I do, it's like, I just want the sunshine. And it seems right when there's sunshine. But He grows us best when it's not so sunny outside. And we have to turn to Him because that's our source of strength. And it's just incredible that He does that. And it's obviously very important that we remember that, because otherwise we would collapse. And it's important that we have each other to help us remember that.
And the sunshine seems brighter
Yeah.
when you get through the stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we mentioned this last week, but let's camp out on it for a minute. All of the redemptive reversals in the Bible are pointing to one in particular. All of these things are a foreshadow of something else. And the big redemptive reversal that all of these others point to is the gospel. All of these things are intended to point us to what Jesus accomplishes for us when He's crucified and then walks out of His own tomb. And it's, yeah, I mean, think about the bigger picture of our redemption. So it's like with Esther, there's captivity, but it's not the Jews, it's humanity. Humanity is in captivity, not to the Persians or the Romans, but to sin and death, to the consequences of our own choices. We are in the situation we're in because we have rebelled against God. And then God He inserts Himself into human history, and He becomes the unlikeliest deliverer. He's a king who doesn't look anything like a typical king, and He chooses to identify with His people. Not just at the risk of His life. You remember Esther said, okay, I'll do this, and if I die, I'll die. Jesus already knew there was no if about it. He identified with His people knowing it was going to cost Him His life. And He did it anyway. And when He walked out of His tomb, He set the reversal in motion. The reversal that is relevant to all of us. So the thing is, we are bound for a happy ending. It might not be in this life, but we are bound for a happy ending because death has been defeated and Jesus has set everything going in the opposite direction. We won't experience the full blessings of that until the other side of the grave, but we will. Jesus has secured for us the opposite of where we started. So all these things, Joseph, Daniel, Esther, all of it ultimately points us to the Messiah and to what it is that He's accomplished for us. He's the pivot point. He's the place where the reversal starts. And, every time I read the Gospels, I think if I had been a disciple and I had seen the crucifixion, I would have thought, it's all over right here. Like, there is no coming back from this. If we executed our Messiah, it's not like God's going to give us a do-over. Like, we're done. We can't come back from this kind of thing. And yet, 3 days later, God accomplished a salvation that nobody was looking for. If He can bring that kind of redemption out of the death of the Messiah, what can He do for us? Because even if we don't have what we would consider happy endings, we do have the promise of Romans 8, which is that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him. And how can He do that unless He's the one who's in control? Unless the God who often doesn't get mentioned is the one pulling the strings. Not just for Esther, but for us too. He's fully in control of our circumstances and our situations, and He will work things out for our good. And it's a promise that He made a long time ago, and He will do whatever it takes to keep His word. All right. Any last comments? Anything you want to add?
I use Matthew Henry a lot, and I don't know when he writes, like in 1700 or something, but he said, as the Jews still celebrate Purim, they go for 3 reasons: for letting them attend His divine service, for the miraculous preservation of their ancestors, this is what they give thanks for, and for the living now to celebrate this day again. So maybe they don't do it anymore, but at that time, apparently that was the outline of what they did when they celebrated that.
Well, but you have, of course they still do it.
But
Of course they still do it in this
yeah,
day.
Susan
I
was saying
mean, that's
maybe.
the byword of Jewish people,
Yeah.
isn't it? Tradition? I'm being silly, but, you know, they're, the ones that are practicing Jews
Yeah,
most certainly
right.
are following, you know, are doing it, yes.
Well, and the thing, when I think about that, it's a bit painful, I think, to think about how many secular Jews there are celebrating this holiday having missed the reversal that actually matters. The reversal that all of that pointed to, which is Easter.
It's just like Christians who are celebrating Easter,
Mhm.
Christmas without thinking about,
That's right.
oh yeah, it's Easter.
That's
Oh
right.
yeah, it's Christmas.
That's right. Yeah,
Here's your gift, here's mine.
that's right. Anything else you want to add?
One thing that struck me was the choice, and it's just a very small thing, that it says the tables were turned, is that in the original language? The reason I'm asking that is because it reminded me of what Christ did when he went.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Overturning the table.
Yeah.
Here the table. That's nine.
I guess I don't know if it literally says that or if it's a figure of speech, but yeah.
Christ overturned the table, just as he overturned the tables again when he came out of the grave.
Yep.
That's the reversal.
Yeah.
Here's your table of the Lord.
Yep.
All of your goods, all your plans, and Lord.
And he has this habit of reversing people's situations. And once you see it, you will see it everywhere. When you read the Old Testament in particular, you will start to see these reversals all over the place. Why is God constantly reversing people's situations? Because it shows he's in control. When he can just reverse people's situations in a snap, it shows that he's the one who's sovereign. Yeah, he loves to raise up the low and bring down the high. All right.